There it is. Sorry. I've got so many tabs open today. It's that kind of day.
I'm in the Metropolitan Museum of Art with Alison Young. We're in an installation by the Chinese artist Xu Bing called Book from the Sky. Chinese characters are above us, they're below us, and they're on either side of us.
Pages containing columns and columns of Chinese text are surrounding us on the walls, hanging from the ceiling, and also on the floor in the open book pages from volumes that he was hand-bound in the form of traditional Chinese book arts.
So on the other side of this map, thousands of Chinese characters printed on this beautiful paper. Below us, a sea of waves made up of open books, and above us, a beautiful billowing sky. 3 long pieces of paper, scroll-like, stretched across the ceiling, filled with Chinese characters.
For Western viewers, it's not immediately clear what the text says, what this piece might be about, and it reminds me of other works around the Chinese art galleries in the Metropolitan Museum of more historical calligraphic arts.
But to a Chinese viewer, the meaning is also elusive.
This is because Xu Bing has actually invented over 1,000 new characters.
So these are not real characters.
Because traditional Chinese characters are composed in a modular way, meaning that different components are brought together to form a character in block form, Xu Bing actually uses some real components and some that are invented in combinations that are entirely new to create a character that looks extremely familiar to somebody who can read Chinese.
So we're surrounded by literally tens of thousands of Chinese characters that don't actually mean anything.
Xu actually discarded any characters that he came up with that looked too inauthentic.
Xu Bing didn't render all of these characters with a brush by hand. Rather, he carved wooden parts, harking back to the ancient Chinese system of movable type, which is far older than Gutenberg's system in the West.
We're looking at a very early form of mass production that relates to the contemporary movements in which print media have played a large role in Xu Bing's upbringing.
He was a young man during the Cultural Revolution, a period when intellectuals were vilified, when the very notion of the individual was distrusted, when everything was about the group, everything was about the state.
Xu Bing was actually very talented as a child in writing and in calligraphy. This skill was identified by teachers and harnessed in service of the state. So like many other young intellectuals, he was sent to the countryside where he was put to work creating banners by hand for things like holidays, weddings, and funerals, where he would be asked to combine modern and traditional forms of calligraphy.
And when Xu Bing was in art school, he was trained in the arts of propaganda, as was expected of anybody involved in arts at this time in China. So it's fascinating with that in mind to look at this overwhelming display of block printing that admits no actual word.
The piece also makes me think of a lot of other works of contemporary Chinese art which use the act of destruction in order to create new meaning. Weiwei dropping a Han Dynasty urn, other artists repeating a text in layers that eventually obliterate its meaning.
So we can't locate meaning in what we read. So where do we look for meaning? We're asked to move from the symbolic representation of the words to the characters themselves and the accumulation of those characters.
As well as the vehicle through which they're delivered. So we're reminded of the way that text is used for propaganda purposes during Mao's regime and the inundation of posters and banners that would have surrounded him, just like these texts surround us here.
But the irony is that this was produced not during Mao's lifetime, but in the period after, when China was flooded with Western literature, and yet the artist has nevertheless created characters that are empty of meaning.
He's observed 2 phases of the consumption of texts in his lifetime. The first being from the regime through the use of propaganda, and the second when China opened up to receiving and translating Western philosophy, theory, literature, and art history. This was consumed by youths who were hungry for information.
I'm struck by the way that books on the floor creating a series of waves that all seem like the sea, and banners that hang from the ceiling function very much as the sky. The title of this is Book from the Sky, and the panels on the walls seem like landscapes.
This is an interesting observation in light of the medium that we're looking at, now considered woodblock printed text to be one of the most non-elitist forms of art and communication because it was direct and because it could be mass-produced and widely disseminated. Whereas scholar painting earlier in Chinese history often depicted the landscape and the natural environment, but very subtle political messages were sometimes conveyed in these compositions, and these were a more elitist form of art.
So here we have subtle references to landscape that represented through text and deep meaning.
Okay, so we'll go back to Xu Bing's Book in the Sky. And look at how it's empty of meaning. How is it empty? How is it empty? Eva, can you help me out? How is it empty?
The characters don't really necessarily mean anything.
Exactly. The characters that he carved in woodblock mean absolutely nothing. So as someone who can't read Chinese, I can't read it, right? And as someone who can read Chinese, they can't read it either, right? So it's empty of meaning, right? And so he intentionally did that, right? So when we look at it, it has all of the characteristics of Chinese calligraphy. It has the thick to thin, it has the organization, it's kind of in the squared sort of form. And so he made over 1,000 new characters for this installation, right? So he made over 1,000 characters, and he carved them out of wood cut, right? So he made each of them by hand. And then when we look at it, we can see that it's composed of several different parts, which they mentioned in the video, but we're going to go ahead and highlight them, right? So we have text prints on paper scrolls. So those long paper scrolls that we did explore a little bit when we looked at Chinese painting, but also when we looked at Japanese print painting. Remember our scroll, the night attack at Hanji, these would, maybe be scrolled up to reveal one element at a time, right? So we have the ceiling is the paper scrolls. Then we have traditional bookbinding. So he made 400 of these, right? Think about how much work that would take, right? He made 400 handmade books all in a row, right? Using traditional print, text printing and traditional bookbinding. And then he used kind of these screens, right? So these separators that you might include in for a room. We have the screens that kind of hang as these kind of colossal paintings on the side wall, right? So if there's so much text, but the text means nothing, what does it represent? Right? This is that part of how is this full of meaning, right? If there's so much text, but you can't read it, what does it all mean? Anyone have an educated guess? Jasmine, can you help? Do you have an educated guess?
Is it like a challenge or like a reaction against the Chinese propaganda that kind of like overwhelm all of its citizens? So
Exactly. So it's kind of this idea that there were posters and billboards and flyers hanging on the wall everywhere. There still is in certain neighborhoods in China, right? You see pictures and you're just inundated with all this information. And Xu Bing, right, he left China, right, because he didn't want his speech cut off, right? He wanted to be able to voice his opinions. And so he found that a lot of the propaganda that he made as a child, right, or a youth, kind of like your age, basically, or a young adult, he found that it was full of doublespeak and it didn't really, it contradicted itself. And it was stuff that he saw everywhere. So this idea that there's all this useless information given to the people to kind of obscure them from the reality of what was really going on, right? So kind of inundated with all information to keep you so that you wouldn't understand how hard things were or what the reality was. Some people kind of think we're living in that world right now. You're inundated with information on your cell phone, so you don't necessarily notice when freedoms are taken away from you, right? So remember that the books, right, are 400 and they're kind of like orderly placed in rows on the floor. And so that could also represent the faithful, right? Represent the people who believe in the cause, believe in the Communist Party, have their faith in the government. I'll use this example as well, is that, you know, coronavirus has been handled really well in China, right? Some people might not believe that, but if you look at the facts and how many cases they have right now, people are used to obeying the government, right? They've been obeying the government for the entire history of China. I shouldn't say all people, because there's always rebellion, but as a generalization, right? And so this idea that people listen to authority, and so he has it very organized in the space where, you know, he could have made 12 books, right? But instead he chose to make 400, right? So there's this idea of a lot, right? And it's very orderly, right? And they also mentioned at the very end is that after Mao, commercialism, Western influences started to flood into society. And so the concept of wanting things from the West, wanting Western food, Western fashion, Western objects, like, you know, iPhones, of course, are a little bit later, but wanting all of these things, you know, is also kind of meaningless. It kind of goes contradictory to traditional values, but also, you know, the values that were established during the time of Mao. So they're kind of living in a time of contradictions. You don't necessarily understand everything around you. And so they also mentioned in the video this idea that there are elements of Chinese painting in the installation, right? So looking at the similarities. So we have our sky, right? We have our sky. We have our mountains, right? And we have our water. So the books are kind of like the water, right? And the screens are kind of like the mountains. And then we have the sky. And this relates to the art of the literati, right? This is people that Mao would have suppressed, right? He would have suppressed it. And so, or he would have been suppressed for his beliefs. And so he left China because of it. Any questions on Book in the Sky? Okay, the next piece we have is called Stadia 2 by Julie Mehretu. And she's Ethiopian and she works out of New York City. She's known for her large scale paintings, and her work tends to focus on globalization. So what I'm going to have us do is look at Stadia 2. And you might be able to tell by just the name, but thinking about what you see in this painting, can you figure out what the setting is? What's the setting? Where does this take place? Rahil, can you help me out? What's your educated guess of what the location of this painting is?
I'm not really sure.
It's called Stadia 2. Stadia sounds kind of like
a stadium.
Stadium, very good. And so when you look at the image, right, there's a few telltale signs that tell us that this looks like it's in a large stadium, right? It has a stylized stadium. If you look in the top part of it, you see a lot of kind of like horizontal lines. And so we see like rows of seats. There's a large central space kind of in the middle and at the base. And then thinking about what stadiums are used for, there's a lot of excitement rendered in this art, in this painting, right? We have a lot of swirling lines. There appears to be confetti. There also appears to be kind of these banners kind of hanging from the rafters. And so if you kind of do a close reading from top to bottom, right, you'll be able to kind of see the virtual imagery, thinking about what you recognize, right? What do you see at the top? So let's just pinpoint at the top. What are some things at the top that tell me it's a stadium other than those rows? You guys see anything else? Isabella, can you help me?
It kind of looks like national flags.
It does. It looks like national flags. However, if you pay really close attention to the flags, they're not really identifiable as a certain country. You see the red, you see like red stripes, which of course makes you think about the American flag. You see red and blue, but there's no white, there's no stars. I feel like there's a Japanese flag here somewhere too, if I remember, or a Canadian flag, but once again, then you don't have the maple leaf. So instead of pointing out like certain countries, she tends to make them kind of just like symbolic of nations in general, right? She doesn't want to like make it seem like it's a specific country, but like just certain, like the concept of nations, right? So there's flags and there's banners. And so you can see those banners, those celebratory banners that are often used when there's a big celebration or like a car sale, right? Because car sales happen on national holidays, that sort of thing. And so there's all of these swirling lines and blocks of color. It appears there's maybe some confetti falling from the ceiling, right? And then other things we mentioned before. And then when you look at the base, it's a lot less busy, right? So at the very bottom, we have these chaotic lines of gray and variations of gray at the top. And then they become a little bit more organized at the bottom, where they almost look like field lines in like a football stadium, right? And then you see a few more banners and flags, mostly just the banners. Oh, something was off from my animation here, right? So thinking about where your eye focuses and where she grabs your attention, when I look at this one, right, it kind of is very busy at the top, but everything sort of leads me to the center of the painting, where there's kind of this void of color, right? And it kind of focuses us on to what would take place in the stadium, right? Why are we all joined together, right? Why are we all joined together in the stadium? Any idea what does this all mean? A lot of people have compared her images to these kind of worldwide celebrations. And a good example of that is something that a lot of Americans don't understand, but the World Cup, which is soccer, right? Or the other football. And so that's something that's celebrated around the world. And so all of these countries bring their national teams. Of course, we tend to bring our women's teams rather than our men's teams, but they celebrate the nation, right? And then people really are really excited about this. This is like a highlight of people's lives every 4 years, right? So it's something that brings the world together, but also kind of separates the world as well, right? Because of course there's going to be winners and losers. So her images, right? Her content, the flags can be either positive or negative, right? When we think about the flag, we think about things like patriotism, but other people from other countries do not understand why we are obsessed with the Pledge of Allegiance or our flag. I have family from Guatemala, and they are just astounded by how many people wear the flag on their clothing. They're like, that just doesn't happen where they live. And people are proud of where they're from. They just don't, it's like this nationalism that we have as Americans. And other countries do too, right? So it could be viewed as a positive thing, as being patriotic, but it also could be a little bit like blinded or obsessed, or more like nationalism, thinking my country is better than your country, or I'm going to isolate myself and we're not going to talk to you because you're different than us, right? But also it could be a concept of the world coming together, right? That we're all united behind a central focus, right? That central imagery part in the middle. Or there's the sense of chaos based on our differences and our isolation. So there's kind of this, You can look at it in two different ways. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's so chaotic, right? Is this image is chaotic intentionally so that you see both sides of that coin, the positive and the negative. So she's been compared to other artists, and she's often compared to Kandinsky. Anyone see any similarities in Kandinsky? I put the piece that's in our 250. Can anyone see any comparisons to Kandinsky? Quanit, do you see anything that's similar?
There's a lot of movement and the colors are vibrant.
Right? There's a lot of black lines, right? Dark lines. There's a lot of movement. There's a lot of bright color, right? And it's abstract, right? It's an abstracted image. She says, besides people like Kandinsky, her major influences are the Bauhaus and Constructivism. And Constructivism comes out of Russia. And keep in mind that Bauhaus and Constructivism come from Cubism, right? So if we think about synthetic Cubism, right? We think about synthetic Cubism, the image is constructed by shapes and lines. And so it's kind of design based. So she thinks very carefully about how she organizes her paintings, how she organizes her space. She uses geometric elements that you would associate with Bauhaus, Constructivism, and Cubism. So let's just finish off by looking at her process. How do you think she makes her paintings? So what she does is she works in layers. And so she tends to work on really big surfaces, either canvas or she'll paint entirely on the wall. And she'll paint one layer and then she will obscure it. So if you notice here, can you see how it's hazy? You guys see the bottom left, how the imagery is kind of hazy? So she'll paint with bright colors and then she'll cover it with like gesso or white paint to kind of suppress the imagery. So suppress is where you kind of tone down the color and it makes it kind of hazy. And then she layers on top of it to create that sense of chaoticness. So what she does is she'll often use projection. So she'll sketch out her imagery and then she'll project it onto the wall and her assistants will trace the imagery and then she'll later paint it in. And so here's some good examples of the scale of many of these works. They're very, very big. Stadia, I actually don't think it's this big. It's probably more like the size of like the screen that we have in the classroom. So it's probably more like 8 feet by 10 feet or something like that. So here's some other examples of her work. You can kind of see now that you're looking through the painting, you can see what parts are hazy, what parts are on top, how it's layered. Very chaotic, some of these pieces. Every time I look at this one, I see the world map. I don't know if that's just me. This one lacks color. This one has a lot of color. Okay, questions on Mehretu? Okay. Our last image on class and society is Ai Weiwei's sunflower seeds. And so Ai Weiwei is probably one of the best known contemporary artists that we have today. He's a Chinese artist. He grew up in the far northwest quarter of China after his father was forced into exile. So his father had alternative beliefs in the government. And so he had to basically move out of his position into the far west to kind of preserve his life. And it was a very harsh environment for Ai Weiwei to kind of grow up in. His art tends to be very critical of the Chinese government stance on democracy and human rights. And in 2011, he was actually detained by the Chinese government for more than 80 days. According to him, he felt like he was near death. I've seen pictures afterwards. He did look like he had lost a lot of weight. And the government had charges against him of tax fraud, but most people believe that it was based on his artworks based on anti-communist stances. So this installation that we have is at the atrium of the Tate Modern. So remember shibboleth, right? The crack in the floor. This was in the exact same location. So the Tate Modern is in London. It's in Turbine Hall. And so what is it all about, right? So this image, right, which we have a weird angle of it. This is the image that the 250 gives us, which is mostly the hall and kind of a close-up of what appears to be sunflower seeds at the bottom, right? So does anyone know what the significance of sunflower seeds are to Ai Weiwei? Why sunflower seeds? As a child, right? As a child, growing up in Mao's time, it was a major food source for people, especially people who grew up in the harsh environments that he did. And sunflower seeds were something that all people could afford. They're very cheap. You could grow them, right? Because you just plant some of those seeds and you can grow your own as well. Now, there's a kind of a communal element to Chinese, to seeds too, to many people from this era. So basically you'd have a bunch of sunflower seeds and it's something you could share with friends, right? You would sit around and eat sunflower seeds, like on the playground, at lunchtime, you know, at parties. It's very, very cheap and everyone can afford it. Another element of this, and we can see it in the propaganda poster on the left, and we also saw that in the Zhu Bing's image, is that you saw a lot of imagery of Mao with a red sun, right? And so Mao was considered the sun, right? He was considered the sun, like the Sun King. We've had Sun Kings like Louis XIV, right? Before, and the Forbidden City as well. And then we think about, he often said that the people were the sunflowers. So at the bottom of this, can you guys see how there's a series of sunflowers? And notice how they are all directed towards him. If you've ever watched a sunflower grow, it comes out of the ground and then it turns to face the sun. It has a sense of it obeys the sun and it grows and it flourishes because of the sun, right? So Mao is the sun and the people are the sunflowers. So of course, Ai Weiwei takes the seeds from the sunflowers, right? So what does the quantity and the organization suggest? Look at all of these sunflower seeds. What does the organization and the quantity suggest? Let's talk about the quantity first. Alana, can you help me? What might the number of seeds suggest?
There are a lot of seeds, so maybe he had some help making them.
He did have a lot of help making them, so we'll talk about that in a second. But let's think about symbolically what the seeds could mean. Why are there so many seeds? Any idea? Alana, I'm gonna stick with you if you don't mind.
Oh, maybe to show the camaraderie between a lot of people.
Right, it's a lot of people. Think about the population of China. You think about how many seeds come from a single sunflower seed. And so it's just this enormous quantity of people represented by those sunflower seeds. And then when I talk about the organization, Ai Weiwei had them poured on the floor of the Tate Modern Turbine Hall. And so they would go and rake it, right? Probably every night after people left, They would rake it to make it look nice and smooth. And then they would keep it kind of contained. Can you see how the edges of it are in a perfect line? And then here something happened, some little kid ran into it, right? And made a little mess. What might that organization mean? Why is it raked? And why is it put into these straight lines? What does that mean? Varun, can you help me out?
Feels like the conformity and like how just everyone's the same.
Exactly. They're being controlled by an outside force, right? It's very contained. There's a sense of being uniform, right? So you're kind of controlled by the regime. And also, this individual seed is kind of lost in this large quantity. This idea that individualism is lost sometimes in the modern world, not in just in communism, right? But in the whole entire modern world. Sometimes we lose the one person in thinking about the whole. So how did Ai Weiwei expect people to interact with the installation? This is actually from the Tate. We're not going to watch it, but when he envisioned this, he thought it would be something for people to enjoy, kind of like a sand pit, right? A sandbox. And so he wanted people to sit in it. He wanted people to play in it. He didn't want people to steal any seeds though, right? People pocketed them all the time. And he wanted them to play. The problem is that it started to pick up all the ceramic dust, right? So there was all this dust kind of floating in the air, and people with asthma and breathing issues, it was causing problems. So the Tate Modern had to rope it off so that people had to go around it. And you can see, once again, people are playing with it, people are taking seeds and so on. But it's kind of interesting because even though people can't enjoy it anymore, like those individual seeds, you know, playing with friends, that sort of thing, it does still have a sense of control and containment. So it still kind of helped with the meaning. It wasn't like the meaning was lost because people couldn't sit in it anymore and make sunflower seed angels. Okay, so I think it was Alana mentioned that how were these seeds made? I had mentioned that there was ceramic dust in the air. They were handmade, right? They were handmade by artisans. Ai Weiwei probably didn't do hardly any of it, right? He chose, I used to know how to pronounce it. Can anyone help me? I have it circled here. If you can help me pronounce it, that'd be great. Basically, this is a major region in China that was known for its imperial pottery. So remember when we talked about Chinese pottery, Chinese porcelain, and how it was revered around the world, right? Even back when it was first originally made. Remember how the Dutch and the English all copied it? It was made in this region in Eastern China. And so he went there and had 600 artisans hand make all of those seeds. So they painted them. I go back to them so you can see a close-up of them. They're all made out of clay and they were all painted to look like seeds. So they're not real sunflower seeds. This is another piece he has that hangs on the wall. And so he's also kind of playing on this concept of made in China, that, you know, we have this great art that was made in China, but then we also think about mass production and things that are cheap that you can buy at Walmart or Target or Amazon. And this idea of this vast quantity of something made in China, and because there's so many of them, it's kind of like they're cheap, right? So kind of playing on commercialism as well. So these are some, any questions on Ai Weiwei? This is the first piece I ever saw of his work. It was in a gallery in Chicago. So he did this large, colossal kind of like chandelier, kind of speaking of excess. They're actually made out of bicycles. Here's a chair installation at a museum. In 2010, he did a lot of imagery based on refugees, because if you remember, there was a lot of North Africans coming to Europe on rafts. So a lot of these are like life preservers, and then rafts people would use. And he would float them in public places. And then the last pieces that I am aware of are his pieces in New York City based on protesting the border walls from the last administration, I guess, as well as this administration. Okay, questions on class and society? Okay, we're gonna finish up with looking at some global art, focusing on some artists from Africa and the Pacific Islands. So we're gonna look at converging of different cultures. So this one is really kind of an interesting one. This is called Pipisola Alfe, or Corned Beef 2000, by the artist Michael Tuffery. And Michael Tuffery is a Pacific Islander. His heritage is not just one, but it's from a series of islands in Polynesia. So he's Samoan, he's from the Cook Islands, and Tahitian, right? So his family is generally, he's a Pacific Islander, but it's a group of, it's a merging of cultures. He lives and works out of New Zealand, and his art tends to explore his Polynesian heritage and the effects of colonialism, excuse me, on his Pacific heritage and just the Pacific Islands in general. So, anyone been to like Hawaii and understood how the Hawaiians are like obsessed with spam? Anyone? Hawaii spam, yeah. What if you were given this gift at a wedding or a party? How would you feel about it? If you were given some potted meat and you opened it up, would you dig right in? No. Emily's like, this is disgusting, this is gross, I'm not gonna select this. But this is something that became very common. If you guys remember, when we looked at Pacific Islands, there was often these big celebrations, these communal celebrations, and they bring traditional food and, you know, celebrate as a group. And so today, quite often when this happens, people also supply people with potted meat. Kind of strange, right? Or at least it seems kind of strange for us. But in Samoa, this is pretty typical. It starts to take place, or starts to take place the place of ceremonial gifts. So why are potted meats taking the place of ceremonial gifts like tapa or fruits from the local region? Anyone have any idea? Where are they getting the potted meat? Katie, do you have an educated guess? Are they making the potted meat themselves?
No.
No, it's imported. So they're importing this. And he said it's being imported from New Zealand, but of course, it's probably been being imported from other places as well. It's being imported by the West. So if we look at the artwork in particular, right? First, we have to kind of look at its name. What is Pisupo? What does it mean? Right? I have this video queued up, but I'm looking at the time. I want to make sure we get through all our artists today. So I'm going to skip it. Feel free to go back to it. People soup means pea soup. It means pea soup. And so pea soup, it becomes the name of anything that is in a can. So it was the very first food that was imported to this region of the world in cans. And the equivalent I would give for this is, think about how many times you say, I need a Kleenex, right? It's like the name brand, but really you want a facial tissue, right? Because you might get a Puffs or a Kleenex or a generic version, right? But we call it Kleenex. So like, it's the first way people were associated with canned foods was pea soup. And so they used it as the name for all food in a can. Does that make sense? Okay. And so why did he choose a bull? Why did he choose a bull? What could a bull be symbolic of? Emily, can you help me out? I'm sorry, I didn't hear the last part of it. Strength, anger, very, very good. A bull, a male cow, is very aggressive, right? It's very aggressive. It's powerful. It's a symbol we've seen, you know, even with the lamassu in the Near Eastern cultures. Remember that, right? A bull is something that's very, very powerful. But also canned beef, right? The stuff that's in the cans it became a favorite food of people from Polynesia, right? It was imported from outside. It was imported from New Zealand. It was imported from the West. It became a popular favorite. And if you think about it, I don't want to spend a long time looking at this, right? But you think about his Samoan culture, right? Think about his Samoan culture. You've maybe seen something like this before, right? Where Samoan men will do this very aggressive dance, right? When they're getting ready for battle, right? And this is rugby, right? They do it to kind of intimidate people. So this is very much reflective of his upbringing, right? Because we're talking about the converging of cultures. We have the Polynesian kind of element of it in that it's aggressive, it's masculine, but it's also beef that's imported to the islands. So he does this to point out some negative effects that beef had on people. So there's some elements here that are kind of bad in general. So we're going to focus on the health, the environment, and the economy. So for beef was not native to the islands. So what started happening is they would import the beef, right, in cans, or they would bring cattle to the islands. What happens when you have an invasive species? It starts to eat the resources, right? It starts to eat the resources. So the cows, right? They ate the natural plants. They caused harm to the environment. The canned beef that they became so obsessed with is really bad for health, right? It's high in salt, it's high in cholesterol, and they started to see that it led to things like diabetes and heart disease that hadn't really existed in this area before, at least not in this quantity, right? And then there's an ecological, environmental issue too, is that there's all this trash. Space is a commodity in the Pacific Islands. The mountains are gods, the waters are gods, right? The land is full of resources, but then there's all this trash to have to deal with. And so it was causing issues to the environment. And then economical is that they were no longer eating their native foods or seafood, and that they were importing things to the islands. So people who usually grew the food and sold the food, right, using the traditional methods, were kind of like out of work. So the form, right, looking at the content of it, it's made of hundreds of recycled open cans of beef that were flattened. And the cool thing about this that you can't see, you can sort of see it in the very bottom, is that it actually is on wheels and it moves. And so I attached a little video here, right? This is not the one, this is the long one. So I'm gonna go to here. So this is a part of an installation piece by Tuffery. And so he would use, he would use fireworks coming out of the mouth of the bull. And he'd take two of these and he'd have them kind of fight. And so they move and they can be pushed and pulled around in this very sort of aggressive manner. Right, so they are movable. Right, and he's done other pieces out of recycled things. So like using mackerel tins to make like yellowfish, right? So like tuna. This one actually smokes. So this is actually a smoker, right? You could actually smoke fish inside of it. So this could have smoke breathing out of it too, kind of like our incense burners from Near East. This one is a turtle that has fish fins that is remote controlled. So this will move too. So you can see he uses a lot of, like a lot of his pieces have functions or are functional as well as sculptural. And then he also does a lot of traditional printmaking. So things based on things like tattooing and whatnot. Okay, questions on Tuffery? Okay, I believe we have two more pieces, so I'm going to try to do a good job on this, but also go a little bit quicker. The next one is called The Swing After Fragonard by Yinka Shonibare, right? And he is a British-born Nigerian, so he's from London and he works out of London, and his work focuses on the concepts of identity, colonialism, authenticity, and power. So he has a lot going on. If you did a search of him, you'd see a vast collection. He's very prolific. He makes a lot of art. He does things like drawings and paintings. He does film and photography, as well as installations. We have an installation or a sculptural piece for ours, but if you did a search for him, you'd see a lot of photography and film in the last few years. So the inspiration for the painting, you probably gathered it from the name. It is The Swing by Fragonard, right? That's the inspiration, a little context for the painting. And so what was the function of Rococo painting, right? What's the function of it? Who remembers? Erin, can you help me? What's the function of Rococo painting? Erin, are you there? Cora, do you mind helping?
Yeah, it was like to show like the very frivolous lifestyle of the higher class.
Exactly. So Rococo was the art of the aristocracy. It was lighthearted and full of classical love themes. And if you think about what happened right after Rococo, right? Think about the excess, not the access, the excess of the Rococo and the reign of the House of Bourbon. Those different Louis XIV and Louis XV, that led to things like the French Revolution, right? The guillotine, where a lot of the French monarchy lost their heads and their lives. Obviously, they lost their lives. So what's missing, right? So what's missing? If you look at this installation as this sculpture, you'll notice that she has lost her head. She's lost her head. She doesn't have her suitor anymore, right? There's no one looking underneath her skirt physically. Her chaperone, the person who's pushing her, is gone. So, right, what does that mean? That means that the viewer, you looking at this artwork, you're the audience, right? And it's like she's flirting with you, right? You're the voyeur. You're the one looking up her skirt. A little disheartening or a little icky, right? So thinking about how does he change the work and how does it change the meaning? What's the emotion that he's getting across, right? Remember that we become the voyeur in it. in that there's the sense of eroticism and sexualization of other cultures. Because if you pay really close attention, you'll notice that she's not wearing a typical Rococo costume. It has a lot of layers to it. It has, detail to it, but it also has like African inspired textiles on it, right? And so it kind of plays on this idea of excess, the voyeurism of and sexualization of other cultures. Think about the large Adalas by Angst, right? It's like this Turkish harem girl, and the West is looking and go, oh wow, we can sexualize her, right? Or I use the example of younger people looking at nudity in National Geographic, and it's people from different cultures who wear, lack of clothing for some particular reason, and people look at it as like sexual where it's not sexual at all, right? That idea, the difference between nude and naked, right? So he likes to make statements on class and morality, right? To kind of talk about the disparities between economic classes. And so looking at the content of it, what do we actually see, right? We've got a life-size headless mannequin, right? So the idea of the guillotine. We have a dress. So the dress is made out of different fabrics that are made for the Dutch wax fabrics that were sold in Africa. And I'll explain that in just a second. So these are fabrics that were imported to Africa. They are not native to Africa, even though that's probably what most people assume. And then we have flowering vines. So there's vines coming from the ceiling and cascading onto the floor. So fake vines. Right? So his work often talks about his Nigerian roots and him kind of exploring his Africanness. And it was actually something in the Art 21 that I've attached to this. He talked about that when he was in art school in London, he had instructors all the time talk about, you should make art about being African. And he's like, that's not just who I am. I want to make work about other things. But then when he really got down to it, he thought about, well, this is my culture. This is who I am. This is the reason things are the way they are. And so he actually did start to embrace and intentionally make works about being African, being Nigerian. So how does he address his culture, right? He wants to connect imperialism with the aristocracy. Of course, who has the power? The monarchy and the aristocracy. And these are the people who are going to go to distant lands and get the wealth from other people, right? So they're going to accumulate their wealth from the colonial class. He also is playing on the concept of rebellion with revolution, the idea that we have the head, right? The decapitated head. The style of clothing is French, right? And it's a scene of leisure. So there's this kind of Western kind of concept too. The fabric is thought to be fabrics from West Africa. The interesting concept, and I should probably note this, I don't think you need to really worry about all of the specifics, but as long as you understand that this style of fabric did not originate in Africa is probably the best thing you can get out of the story, right? Is that basically what happened is the English were trying to import fabric to Indonesia, right? So in Southwest Asia, right? They're trying to import like batik, like native fabrics. They're trying to make fabrics to sell to people who can make it themselves, right? Because they've got these big factories in London, they can make it mass produced, they can make it cheaper. And so they shipped it to Indonesia, and guess what? The people didn't buy it. They're like, we can make our own, ours is better, right? So what did they do? They put it on a ship and they sent it to Africa. And of course, who controlled the boats? The Dutch, right? So there's a complex concept of globalization and colonialism and just how this stuff was moving from London or England to Indonesia, to Africa. And when we look at these fabrics, we're like, oh, African textiles. But they are not African. They're actually Indonesian. Right? So it's this idea of fake Africanness, playing on stereotypes that were then assimilated by Nigerian culture, right? Because the people in Africa did buy the stuff and it did become a part of their culture. Any questions on that? Did I explain it good enough? Okay. So here's some other examples of a dual. This looks like Southern bells to me. Here's some of those fabrics that these things are made out of. You can see the kind of like the bold colors and the prints. Here's that Art 21 if you're interested. He's been doing a lot of pieces based on photography, looking at different artists. So this is inspired by Goya. This is inspired by, these are photos inspired by the Rake's Progress by Hogarth. Remember how in England they taught morality? And so he did a whole series of photography kind of teaching morality. Okay, shoot, we've got two more. I forgot about this one. Questions? Okay. Old Man's Cloth by Anatsui, right? He's from Ghana, but works out of Nigeria. And he combines traditional art from Ghana and Nigeria to create abstract art. This is pretty straightforward, so this one should go a little bit faster. Okay, so what's so traditional about these? So this piece that we see right now, what traditional art forms does it reflect? Maybe you notice some of the colors being used, right? It looks a lot like African textiles, as well as the gold that we associate with Western Africa, right? So there's a reference to traditional textiles, things like kente cloth from Southern Ghana, or just traditional textiles often incorporate the color gold, and gold is normally associated with royalty. And the other colors often represent the diversity of the African culture in general. So normally, a lot of times when people think about Africa and they think about African textiles, this is actually where people's mind goes, right? Gold, green, red, black. Okay, remember that where he's from in Ghana and Nigeria is part of the Gold Coast. And the Ashanti people, remember the Ashanti people with the golden stool? They were in charge of the gold trade, right? They were in charge of the gold trade. So what is his piece made of? Can you tell looking at this? What is it made of? It's made from thousands of drink tops. He got them from a distillery in the town that he was working out of, right? So there's beer tops, other pieces of him, other kinds of wine, like wine and other kinds of tops as well for alcohol. And the reason he's using beer tops is that he's making the connection with the triangle trade. Guys, remember the triangle trade from history class? We've also talked about this when we talked about colonialism as well, that alcohol was brought to Africa from England via the rum that was made in the Caribbean. So remember that, right? Slave trade went from Africa to the Caribbean to the Americas to grow sugar. And then sugar was imported to England, and England made alcohol out of it. And they sent it back to America, and they sent it to Africa, right? That triangle trade. So what do you think the commentary is? Besides the historical content, right? He saw how alcohol was ruining society, right? It's kind of woven into traditional society now, right? So he collected those beer caps and labels from his neighborhood that he was living in. And this idea of using alcohol became part of something that was in tradition. So they would pour alcohol or libations on venerations of ancestor objects once they had the alcohol, right? But it also became something that people consumed, right? Led to things like unemployment, alcoholism. So it has negative connotations as well. So he weaves these together with wire, and he uses things like power tools like chainsaws to cut things. He uses welding torches when necessary, and he typically hangs them on the wall. So almost every piece I've ever seen by him is hung from the wall. And so when we look at it, is it two-dimensional or three-dimensional? It's kind of ambiguous. He has the surfaces undulate. So he doesn't actually tell the gallery exactly how to hang it on the wall. He lets them kind of decide how to do it with the idea that it is a sculptural wall hanging. And so it has this kind of undulating surface that's supposed to imitate the ocean. So not only does it represent that triangle trade, but the mode of transportation. So it has this three-dimensional sort of quality to it. And the gallery can kind of decide, or museum can decide where those waves are. This is the one that's in the textbook. This one looks a little bit more like traditional fabric. Okay, last one. This is another one of those that's a little difficult for me. So hopefully I broke it down easily to explain it to you. Okay, so this is Praying Mantra by Wangechi Mutu, and she's from Kenya, and she works out of New York City. The style which she belongs is called Afrofuturism. Afrofuturism, and in her work, she often creates cyborgs. So cyborgs are kind of these people who are aided by mechanical devices or computer implants. Now, if they didn't tell me that they were cyborgs, I would never guess that they were cyborgs. They definitely look like fantasy creatures, and you'll see those in a second. But to me, they don't necessarily look like cyborgs. So take that as a note, write that down. Okay, so to save some time, we're gonna skip this portion. But what I would like you to know is that her work is sculptural, and she also does collage, right? Which is the piece that we have. So she basically makes sculptures, she draws, and she does collage. So the piece we have is in collage. And if you remember, collage is basically where you glue down pieces of paper that you have cut and arranged, right? Once again, kind of rooted in synthetic cubism. And then she uses mixed media. So it's on Mylar. If you notice, the background is kind of hazy. Mylar is like a translucent plastic, so you can sort of see through it. So what's the setting? Where does this take place? Jeffrey, can you help me out? What appears to be the setting? Very good. So it's probably set in nature, right? We have a forest or a garden behind her. And then if you look at how she's posed, she's reclining. And that's part that's kind of ambiguous. Like, what is she reclining on? It looks like a blanket, but is it a rack? Is it indoors? Is it outdoors? It's a little ambiguous. And her pose is sexualized. Her pose is kind of sexual. And so in her work, she's making commentaries on traditional images of women in art history, right? She says this is not something that, we're making up. She says it in an interview that is connected with the video. And so in her artwork, she's looking at people like Titian and Manet and Angst, right? And seeing how women have been sexualized in art. right? And she, of course, is a female artist. So her explanation of how women are sexualized, a lot of it comes from the name of the painting or of the collage. It's called praying mantra, right? Praying mantra. And so let me go shoot, right? This is the question I was thinking of it. What does that mean, the name mean? What's a mantra? Does anyone know what a mantra is? Does anyone know what a praying mantis is? Right? So a mantra is a ritual. It comes from the Greek for prophet. So it's normally something that you kind of do for like prayer or to create peace. But then there's also a reference to a praying mantis, right? And a praying mantis is an insect that can camouflage itself. And remember that female praying mantises eat the males after mating, right? So this idea that she's kind of this aggressive female. So if we go back to looking at her, is she a victim and vulnerable, or is she pretty, right? It's kind of this strange, this is kind of part of this cyborg-like creature here, right? She's an altered human. She's altered. And so what Mutu did is she collaged human and animal parts, objects, and machine parts in her images. Now in this one, I don't really see machine parts, but I do see that there are bird feathers sprouting out the back of her head, right? So in this yellow circle at the top, she has a greenish yellow snake. So on the fabric, you might have thought it was part of the pattern, but there's this green snake that comes out of this yellow portion. You guys see it here, right? We have this green snake that comes from her fingers, and then her ears have chicken feet, insect legs, and pinchers coming down from it. I tried to really blow that up, but I couldn't get it better than what we see right now. So take it, my word for me, it's chicken feet, insect legs, and pinchers, right? And so Mutu says, the female is enhanced with mechanical devices, plastic surgery to become more powerful. So she's kind of talking about concepts of beauty. How do women change and alter their physical bodies to become more attractive? So this idea of like plastic surgery and stuff. And when you look at the body, doesn't it seem bloody? It's almost like you can see the outside and the inside, right? How does it suggest her African heritage? Does anyone have any ideas of how it suggests her African heritage? Oh. Sorry, go back here. So if you look at it, the blanket that she's resting upon comes from the Kuba people. And so this is a traditional fabric. The tree could be viewed as the Garden of Eden, right? This could be an image of Eve, but also it is emblematic of the creation myths that come from Mutu's ancestral people from Kenya, right? The serpent, right? The serpent is often linked with Eve, right? And the Bible creation story. So there's, different elements, the snake, right? Being like the devil, the tree come from Christianity, which of course was imported to Africa, right? So here you can see some of her collages and her other pieces and how they really are kind of a blending of collage to kind of juxtapose these European qualities and African qualities. Okay, we are done. Woohoo, done with all new work. Let me know if I forgot something. right? When you look in your note takers, if there's something empty, I think I covered it all. But once again, try to finish up your note takers for Friday, right?